The wind howled like a hungry wolf, a cry of pure desolation that ripped through the fabric of the night. It clawed at the sodden silk of the wedding gown, now a tattered, mud-caked shroud clinging to a shivering frame. Alara didn't know how long she had been running. Hours? Days? Time had dissolved into a merciless rhythm of panicked breaths and aching muscles, each step a testament to the terror that propelled her forward. The storm was a reflection of the tempest in her soul, a violent, chaotic thing that sought to wash away the memory of Bartholomew Croft's face. A face of cold, possessive cruelty masked by a veneer of societal grace. He had not wanted a wife. He had wanted a beautiful possession, a bird for his gilded cage, and when she had finally found the courage to flee on the very eve of their union, his rage had become the thunder that now chased her across the unforgiving frontier. Her lungs burned with the icy air, her bare feet were shredded by rock and thorn, but the physical pain was a dull echo of the deeper wound of betrayal. Her own father had sold her, trading his daughter's happiness for a business alliance with a man whose soul was as barren as the windswept plains around her. A sudden, blinding flash of lightning split the sky, illuminating a sight that made her heart seize, not with fear, but with a desperate, impossible flicker of hope. Ahead, nestled in a grove of ancient pines, sat a small, dark shape, a cabin. A single point of golden light glowed in its window, a lone star in a universe of darkness. With the last dregs of her strength, she stumbled toward it, her vision blurring, the roar of the wind and her own blood pounding in her ears. The wooden porch seemed to rise up to meet her, a solid, unyielding reality in her nightmarish flight. Her knees buckled, her hand reached out, scrabbling against the rough-hewn wood, before she collapsed into a heap of ruined silk and broken hope. The world spun into blackness, but not before she heard the scrape of a chair from within, the heavy thud of boots, and the groan of a door swinging open against the storm. Have you ever wondered if the universe has a design? If the most violent storms are sent not to destroy, but to deliver us to the one shore we were always meant to find? This is a story about two souls lost in the wilderness of their own grief, and the night a tempest brought them together not by chance, but by a destiny written in the heart of the storm itself. It is a story of how a house of solitude can become a home for the heart, and how the deepest wounds can be healed by a love that asks for nothing but offers everything. For 10 years, the cabin had been Josiah's monastery and his prison. He had built it with his own hands, felling the timber and setting the stones, creating a fortress not against the wilderness, but against the world of men. The world that had taken everything from him. The laughter of his wife, Sarah, and the bright, curious eyes of his son, Daniel, were ghosts that haunted the quiet corners of the single room. Their memory was a constant, dull ache in his chest, a pain he had learned to live with, to nurture even, as a penance for surviving the fever that had claimed them. He had been a gunslinger then, a man whose name was whispered in saloons from Dodge City to Tombstone, but his skill with a Colt had been useless against the silent enemy that stole his family. So he had buried his guns, buried his heart, and retreated to this isolated patch of land, seeking not peace, but a silence profound enough to drown out the echoes of what he had lost. His life was a Spartan routine. Chop wood, check his traps, hunt for his supper, and stare into the fire as the shadows grew long. Each day a perfect, painful replica of the one before. He was a stoic protector of his own solitude, a man emotionally wounded and withdrawn from a society he no longer trusted. The storm that raged outside was a familiar companion, its fury a welcome distraction from the silent storm within. He sat at his rough-hewn table, a cup of weak coffee in his hand, when he heard it, a sound that did not belong. A soft, desperate scrape on his porch, a sound almost lost in the gale. He froze, his hand instinctively moving to where his pistol would have once hung. Old habits died hard. He told himself it was the wind, a branch torn from a pine, but then came a thud, a heavy, final sound of a body giving way. Cursing under his breath, he rose. His sanctuary was sacrosanct. No one knew of this place, but his honor, the one part of his old self he hadn't managed to bury, would not allow him to ignore it. With a heavy sigh that seemed to carry the weight of a decade of loneliness, he unbolted the door and pulled it open. The wind roared in, throwing rain and leaves across the floor. And there, on his porch, was the impossible. A woman, soaked to the bone, her white dress. A wedding dress, he realized with a jolt, ruined and clinging to her like a second skin. She was unconscious, her face deathly pale against the dark, wet wood. For a moment, he simply stared, his mind struggling to reconcile this vision with the harsh reality of his existence. It felt like a dream or a trick of the grief that was his constant shadow. But the rain plastering her dark hair to her cheek was real. The tremor that ran through her fragile body was real. With a grunt, he bent down, his guarded, solitary world shattered in an instant. He scooped her into his arms, surprised by how light she was, a broken bird fallen from the sky. As he carried her inside and shut the door, sealing them in against the storm, he felt a flicker of something he hadn't felt in a decade. A purpose beyond his own survival. He was letting the world in, and he knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that nothing would ever be the same. Elara awoke to the gentle crackle of a fire and the scent of wood smoke and pine. For a moment, she was suspended in a place without memory. A warm, safe cocoon that felt more real than the waking world. Then the terror came flooding back, the flight, the storm, the cold, gnawing fear of Bartholomew's pursuit. She sat up with a gasp, her eyes flying open. The movement sent a wave of dizziness through her, and a sharp pain lanced through her bruised feet. She was lying on a narrow cot, covered by a heavy, coarse wool blanket. Across the small, single-room cabin, a man sat with his back to her, staring into the flames of a stone hearth. He was a large man, his shoulders broad under a simple homespun shirt, his presence filling the small space with a quiet, intimidating stillness. Fear, cold and sharp, pierced through her exhaustion. Had she escaped one monster only to be captured by another? She scanned the room, her heart hammering against her ribs. It was starkly masculine and impeccably clean. A rifle rested on a rack above the door. A stack of books sat on a small crate. There were no signs of cruelty, only a profound and deliberate solitude. The man must have heard her gasp. He turned his head slowly, and she saw his face for the first time in the flickering firelight. It was a face carved from the harshness of the land itself, with lines etched around his eyes and a jaw set in a permanent expression of grim endurance. His eyes, however, were not cruel. They were a startlingly clear gray, and in their depths, she saw not malice, but a deep, weary sadness, a sorrow so profound it seemed to have settled into his very bones. He said nothing, simply watched her, his expression unreadable. Elara clutched the blanket to her chest, her voice a raw whisper. "Where am I?" His voice, when it came, was as rough as gravel, a sound unused to conversation. "My cabin. You collapsed on the porch." He gestured with his chin toward a steaming mug on the floor beside the cot. "Drink this. It's broth." He asked no questions, made no demands. The simplicity of his statement was disarming. She expected interrogation, threats, or at the very least, a barrage of inquiries about the ruined wedding dress he had carefully hung to dry near the fire. Instead, there was only a quiet, watchful silence. Hesitantly, she reached for the mug. The warmth seeped into her cold hands, a small, grounding comfort in a world that had been thrown into chaos. She sipped the broth, the savory liquid a balm to her raw throat. He turned back to the fire, granting her a semblance of privacy. She watched his rigid back, the way he held himself as if bracing against an invisible blow. This was not a man like Bartholomew, who thrived on noise, dominance, and the fear of others. This man seemed to be at war with something inside himself, a battle fought in the silence of this remote fortress. As the warmth of the broth and the fire spread through her, a fragile, tentative sense of safety began to take root in the ravaged soil of her fear. She was in a stranger's home, a solitary, intimidating man, yet for the first time in days, the frantic pounding of her heart began to slow. She was a survivor, and she knew that survival depended on reading people. And her instincts, honed by years of navigating her father's whims and Bartholomew's veiled threats, told her that the danger was not in this cabin. The danger was still out there, in the world beyond these solid wooden walls. The storm broke on the third day, the clouds parting to reveal a sky washed clean and brilliant blue. The world outside the cabin window seemed reborn, glistening and new, and Alara felt a similar, tentative renewal within herself. The physical wounds were healing. The cuts on her feet were clean and bandaged with strips of cloth the silent man had provided, and the deep, bone-weary exhaustion was slowly receding. She had spent the first 2 days in a haze of sleep and sipping the broth he would leave by her cot, their interactions limited to his terse, one-word answers to her whispered questions. His name, she learned, was Josiah. He offered no more, and she did not press. Now, feeling a measure of strength return, she knew she could not remain an invalid. She swung her legs off the cot, the rough floorboards cool beneath her mended feet. Josiah was outside. The rhythmic thud of his axe splitting would a steady, reassuring beat in the morning quiet. She looked at her wedding dress, still hanging by the fire. It was a symbol of her bondage, a ghost of the life she had narrowly escaped. Taking a deep breath, she found a small sewing kit in her meager bundle of belongings she'd managed to escape with and set to work. She would not wear the color of a bride again. Using a knife from the kitchen, she carefully cut away the ruined lace and hem, shortening the dress to a more practical length. With dye made from berries she found in a small jar, she began the slow process of transforming the stark white into a muted, earthy brown. It was an act of reclamation, of turning a symbol of her oppression into one of survival. When Josiah entered the cabin for his midday meal, he stopped in the doorway, his eyes falling on her work. He said nothing, but she saw a flicker of something in his gray eyes. Not surprise, but a quiet, grudging respect. He simply nodded, a barely perceptible motion, and went about preparing their food. In the days that followed, a new, unspoken routine formed between them. She took over the cooking, her simple but flavorful meals a welcome change from his monotonous fare. She swept the floors, mended his worn shirts, and brought a touch of order to the cabin's interior that softened its Spartan edges. He, in turn, continued his work outside, his powerful presence a silent shield around their small world. The slow burn of trust began not in conversation, but in shared tasks. It was in the way he left a bucket of fresh water for her each morning without being asked, and the way she ensured a hot meal was waiting for him when he returned, his hands raw from his work. It was in a shared glance over the dinner table, a silent communication that spoke more than words ever could. She began to see the man beneath the stoic protector. She saw the gentleness in his large, calloused hands as he tended to a wounded bird he found, his touch surprisingly deft. He started to speak more, not about himself, but about the land. He taught her the names of the trees, the calls of the different birds, the signs of a coming change in the weather. His words were short, practical, but they were a bridge between their two solitudes. For Josiah, her presence was a disruption he was slowly, reluctantly, beginning to cherish. The cabin, once a hollow monument to his grief, now held the soft scent of baking bread and the quiet rustle of her movements. He found himself watching her as she worked, her brow furrowed in concentration, and the icy fortress around his heart began to feel the first, tentative rays of a long-forgotten sun. It was a fragile, dangerous warmth, but it was life, and he had been dead for a very long time. A week bled into 2, and the sanctuary of the cabin became Alara's entire world. The terror of her escape began to feel like a distant dream, a story that had happened to someone else. Here, in the quiet rhythm of sunrises and sunsets, marked by the steady chop of Josiah's axe and the crackle of the evening fire, she felt a sense of peace she had never known. The opulence of her former life, with its stifling rules and hidden cruelties, seemed pale and meaningless compared to the simple, profound reality of this existence. She had discovered a strength within herself she never knew she possessed, a resilience born not of defiance, but of quiet competence. One evening, as they sat in their usual comfortable silence after supper, she found the courage to finally speak of the shadow that haunted her. He was a man who collected beautiful things. She began, her voice low, her hands twisting in her lap. Birds in cages, butterflies under glass. He wanted me to be his most prized specimen. She didn't look at Josiah, but she felt his stillness, the intense focus of his attention. She told him of Bartholomew Croft, of his chilling charm that concealed a heart of ice, of his possessive rage and the way his eyes would go flat and cold when he was displeased. She spoke of her father's business, the contract that had been her dowry, and the suffocating feeling of being property, her future signed away on a piece of paper. "I knew if I married him, I would die," she whispered, the words raw with a truth she had barely dared to admit to herself. Not all at once, but slowly, day by day. He would have extinguished whatever light I had inside me. When she finished, a profound silence filled the small cabin. She finally risked a glance at him. His face was a mask of granite. His jaw clenched so tightly a muscle jumped along his cheek. The look in his gray eyes was no longer just sad. It was a cold, familiar fury she recognized as the look of a man who understood violence and evil on a primal level. He didn't offer empty platitudes or reassurances. He simply rose, walked to a small, dusty chest in the corner, and unlocked it. From within, he pulled a small object and placed it on the table between them. It was a wooden bird, a tiny, exquisitely carved bluebird, its wings outstretched as if in mid-flight. Its perfection was breathtaking. "My son, Daniel," Josiah said, his voice thick with an emotion he could no longer contain. "He loved birds. I carved this for him the week before the fever took him. And his mother." The words hung in the air, heavy and solid with a decade of unspoken grief. It was not a story, but a confession, an offering of his own profound wound to match hers. He had lost his family, his future, his light. He had not been there to protect them, and he had been punishing himself for it ever since. In that moment, Alara understood everything. His solitude, his gruffness, his silent pain. They were two sides of the same coin, two souls scarred by loss and cruelty, one at the hands of a man, the other at the hands of fate. She reached out, her fingers gently tracing the smooth wood of the carved bird. "It's beautiful," she said softly. It was more than a bird. It was a symbol of love, of loss, and now, of a shared understanding that transcended words. The cabin was no longer just his sanctuary or her refuge. It had become their shared space, a place where two broken people could begin to piece themselves, and perhaps each other, back together. The changing of the seasons from the harshness of late spring to the gentle warmth of early summer mirrored the subtle shift within the cabin's walls. The air, once thick with unspoken grief and cautious distance, now held a new, fragile tenderness. Alara, emboldened by their shared confessions, began to bring life back to the dormant parts of the homestead. Behind the cabin, she discovered a small, overgrown plot of land, its fence broken, its soil choked with weeds. It had been Sarah's garden. She could feel it. Without asking permission, she set to work, pulling weeds, turning the soil, and mending the fence with a determination that came from a deep, instinctual need to nurture something back to health. She found a few packets of old seeds, beans, squash, and hardy wildflowers, in a tin box in the small barn, and she planted them with a prayerful hope. Josiah watched her from a distance, his heart a battlefield of conflicting emotions. Seeing her there, where Sarah had once knelt, her hands in the same earth, was a sharp, stabbing pain. It felt like a betrayal of his grief, a grief he had clung to as the last living piece of his family. Yet, seeing the life she was coaxing from the dead ground, seeing the way the sun caught in her hair as she worked, stirred a different feeling, a reluctant, terrifying hope. The garden became a symbol of their unspoken bond. He began to help, not with words but with actions. He would leave his sharpest spade by the gate for her, or haul buckets of water from the creek without her having to ask. One day, she looked up to find he had repaired the entire fence, its posts straight and strong. Their life fell into a rhythm of shared purpose. One evening, as a sliver of a moon hung in the twilight sky, The peace was shattered by a single terrifying thought that she spoke aloud. "He will find me," she said, her voice barely a whisper. The idea had been a constant hum beneath the surface of her newfound peace, but saying it gave it a dreadful power. Josiah stopped sharpening his knife by the fire and looked at her. The softness that had begun to touch the corners of his eyes was gone, replaced by the hard, flinty resolve of the man he used to be. He did not dismiss her fear. He met it head-on. "I won't let him hurt you," he said. The 4 words were not a comfort. They were a vow, a declaration of intent spoken with the flat finality of a death sentence. It was a promise that changed everything. From that day on, their routine included a new element. After their morning chores, he would take her to a clearing deep in the woods. He unburied his past, both literally and figuratively, digging up the oilcloth-wrapped parcel that held his old Colt and a heavy Winchester rifle. He placed the rifle in her hands. "A woman on the frontier should know how to use one," he stated simply. His training was patient and methodical. He taught her how to stand, how to breathe, how to aim, how to squeeze the trigger without flinching. He was transforming her from a victim into a fighter, giving her the tools for her own agency. And in teaching her to be strong, he was rediscovering his own purpose. He was no longer just a man hiding from his ghosts. He was a protector again. And as Alara grew more confident, her hands steady, her aim true, she knew she was no longer the frightened woman who had collapsed in the storm. The frontier, and the quiet, wounded man who inhabited it, had forged her into someone new, someone who would not be a bird in a cage ever again. The telltale sign of the world's intrusion was subtle at first. A broken twig on a game trail that shouldn't have been broken. A set of hoof prints from a shod horse where only wild animals should roam. To an ordinary man, they were nothing. To Josiah, they were a scream in the silence. His senses, honed by years as a scout and a gunslinger, and sharpened by a decade of solitary vigilance, went on high alert. The peace they had carefully constructed over the summer months felt paper-thin, a fragile pane of glass about to be shattered. He didn't tell Alara at first. He didn't want to see the fear return to her eyes, the fear he had worked so hard to banish. Instead, he became a ghost, melting into the woods for hours at a time, circling his own property, his movements silent and predatory. He was mapping the intrusion, understanding the threat. He found the scouts' cold camp a mile to the east, hidden in a ravine. The man was professional, careful, but not careful enough. Josiah watched him for a full day, a cold knot tightening in his gut. The man was surveying the cabin, taking notes, charting the routines Josiah and Alara had fallen into. He was an advanced man for a larger force, for Bartholomew Croft. The time for quiet observation was over. That evening, as twilight bled across the sky, Josiah moved. He circled behind the scouts' camp, silent as a shadow, the Colt that now hung permanently on his hip a cold, heavy weight of reassurance. The scout was tending to his horse when Josiah's voice cut through the quiet. "You're a long way from home." The man spun around, his hand flying to his pistol, but froze when he saw the barrel of Josiah's own gun leveled steadily at his chest. The scout was young, cocky, but he was no fool. He recognized the look in Josiah's eyes, a complete and utter lack of fear, a chilling readiness that spoke of countless life-or-death encounters. "I'm just a trapper," the man stammered, his bravado evaporating. "Your hands are soft for a trapper," Josiah said, his voice flat. "And your horse is too fine. You work for Bartholomew Croft." It wasn't a question. The flicker of shock in the man's eyes was all the confirmation he needed. "Leave," Josiah commanded. "Ride east and don't look back. Tell your master that the woman he's looking for is under my protection. Tell him there is nothing for him here but a grave." He let the threat hang in the air, its meaning unmistakable. The scout, pale and sweating, needed no further encouragement. He mounted his horse and fled, not daring to look back. Josiah watched him go, knowing this was not a victory, but merely a declaration of war. He had bought them time, nothing more. He returned to the cabin as darkness fell. Alara was waiting, her face etched with worry. She had known something was wrong. "He's coming, isn't he?" she asked, her voice steady despite the tremor she couldn't hide. Josiah nodded, his face grim. "He is." The peace was officially over. Their sanctuary had been breached. He looked around the small, warm room, at the woman who had brought life back into its desolate walls, and the cold fury he had buried for 10 years began to burn hot. He started barring the windows and checking his ammunition. The slow burn of their shared healing was over. The time for punchy, brutal action had arrived. The fortress he had built to keep the world out would now be used to defend the only part of the world he had left to care about. The dawn arrived not with birdsong, but with the distant, ominous drumming of hoofbeats. It was a sound that promised violence, a war party descending upon their tiny island of peace. Josiah stood at the window, the Winchester rifle feeling like a natural extension of his arm. He had spent the night preparing, transforming the cozy cabin into a defensible fortification. Every angle was covered, every weapon loaded and ready. Beside him, Alara held the second rifle, her knuckles white but her face set with a grim determination that made his chest swell with a fierce, protective pride. She was not the terrified woman he had found in the storm. She was a soldier standing her ground. Through the trees they emerged, 10 riders, led by a man on a magnificent black stallion. Bartholomew Croft was exactly as Alara had described him. Handsome, impeccably dressed, and radiating an aura of arrogant entitlement. He rode as if he owned the very land they stood on. He halted his men just beyond rifle range, a cruel, self-satisfied smirk on his face as he surveyed the small cabin. "Alara, my dear," his voice boomed, slick and cultured. "This foolishness has gone on long enough. Come out now. I am a forgiving man. I will overlook this rural adventure of yours." Alara flinched at the sound of his voice, but she did not lower her rifle. Josiah stepped out onto the porch, a lone, imposing figure against the rustic wood. "She's not going anywhere," he called out, his voice a low growl that carried easily in the tense morning air. "This doesn't concern you, old man. This is a matter between me and my betrothed." "She is under my protection," Josiah stated simply. "There's nothing more to be said." Croft's smirk vanished, replaced by a mask of cold fury. "I am Bartholomew Croft. I own half the territory. I will not be denied by some broken-down squatter. I will have what is mine." He motioned to his men, a group of hired guns with hard, merciless faces. "Burn him out, and be careful not to damage the merchandise." The first shot came from one of the riders, splintering the doorframe next to Josiah's head. He didn't even flinch, melting back inside as the air erupted with the roar of gunfire. The siege had begun. The next hour was a chaotic symphony of violence. Gunshots echoed through the valley, with splintered, glass shattered. Josiah was a master of his deadly craft, a phantom moving from window to window, his shots precise and devastating. He was not aiming to kill, not yet, but to wound and disable, to break their nerve. He was a force of nature, a one-man army fueled by a decade of repressed rage and a newfound will to protect. But he was outnumbered. 2 of Croft's men broke from the line, racing toward the back of the cabin with torches. Josiah was pinned down at the front. "Alara! The back window!" he yelled. The moment of truth had arrived. All the training, all the preparation culminated in this. Alara moved to the rear window, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She saw the 2 men, their faces illuminated by the flickering torchlight, their expressions cruel. The girl she used to be would have screamed, would have frozen in terror. But that girl was gone. She rested the rifle barrel on the sill, took a steadying breath just as Josiah had taught her, and squeezed the trigger. The rifle bucked against her shoulder, and one of the men cried out, clutching his leg as he fell. The second man, stunned, looked up toward the window, and she fired again. The shot went wide, but it was enough. He dropped the torch and scrambled back into the trees. She had done it. She had faced the dragon and not blinked. The realization sent a surge of pure, unadulterated power through her. At the front, the brief lull in the attack gave Josiah an opening. He saw her face, flushed with adrenaline and triumph, and a fierce, wild grin touched his lips. They were a team, family, and they would not be broken. The firefight raged, the small cabin enduring the onslaught like a rock in a storm-tossed sea. Croft's men were ruthless, but Josiah was smarter, using the terrain and the cabin's solid construction to his advantage. He and Alara moved in a seamless, unspoken rhythm, covering each other. A two-person army against a tide of malice. But their ammunition was finite, and Croft's rage was limitless. Seeing his men falter, Bartholomew's arrogance boiled over into pure, murderous fury. "Useless fools!" he roared, dismounting from his horse. He drew a polished, silver-inlaid pistol. "I'll do it myself." He charged toward the cabin, using his own men as shields, his eyes wild with possessive madness. He no longer cared about taking Alara back unharmed. He only cared about destroying the man who had defied him. Josiah saw him coming. This was the moment of reckoning. "Stay here," he ordered Alara, his voice low and final. He threw open the cabin door and stepped out onto the porch, facing his enemy. The remaining hired guns ceased their fire, watching the confrontation unfold. It was no longer about money. It was a primal duel between two alphas. "You!" Croft snarled, his handsome face contorted with hate. "You think you can take what is mine? She is property. My property. She is a human being," Josiah said, his voice calm. The quiet honor in his words a stark contrast to Croft's screeching entitlement. "And she chose to be free. You can't own a soul, Croft." "I will own her grave," Croft screamed, raising his pistol. The world slowed to a crawl. The silver of Croft's gun gleamed in the morning sun. The click of the hammer being pulled back was unnaturally loud. Josiah reacted on pure instinct, his draw a blur of motion perfected over a lifetime of violence. His Colt was in his hand, roaring to life a fraction of a second before Croft's. The shot was perfect. Croft staggered back, a look of utter disbelief on his face. He looked down at the dark, spreading stain on his pristine white shirt, then back up at Josiah. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. He collapsed into the dust, his reign of tyranny ending not with a bang, but with a pathetic, inglorious thud. A stunned silence fell over the clearing. The hired guns, their paymaster dead, had no more reason to fight. They looked at each other, then at the cold, implacable figure of Josiah standing on the porch. One by one, they holstered their weapons, mounted their horses, and rode away, melting, back into the wilderness, leaving the dead man to the buzzards. The dust began to settle. The air, thick with the acrid smell of gunpowder, slowly cleared. Alara rushed out of the cabin, her eyes flying to Josiah. He was leaning against the doorframe, his face pale. A dark patch was spreading on his left side. "You're hurt?" she whispered, her voice choked with relief and terror. He looked down as if just noticing the wound. "It's nothing," he grunted, but his knees buckled. She caught him, her strength surprising them both, and helped him sink to the porch steps. The threat was vanquished. The battle was won. As she knelt beside him, tearing a strip from her dress to press against the wound, she looked into his pain-filled but steady gray eyes. In the aftermath of the storm of violence, a quiet, unbreakable peace settled between them. They had stood together, fought together, and saved each other. He was no longer just her protector, and she was no longer just his charge. They were partners, forged in fire, their futures now inextricably, beautifully, intertwined. The weeks that followed the siege were a time of quiet healing. The bullet had passed clean through Josiah's side, a painful but not life-threatening wound. Under Alara's tender and surprisingly skilled care, he mended slowly. For the first time in 10 years, he was the one being looked after, the one forced into stillness. He watched as she managed the homestead with a quiet confidence that was now second nature to her. She tended the garden, which was now thriving, its green shoots a vibrant promise of life. She cared for the livestock, her voice soft as she spoke to the chickens and the milk cow he had bought before the trouble started. The cabin, once his tomb of grief, was now unequivocally a home, filled with the scent of her baking, the sound of her humming, and the undeniable warmth of her presence. The ghosts of Sarah and Daniel were still there, but they were no longer specters of pain. They were gentle memories, smiling now, at peace, content that the house was filled with life and love again. His redemption had not come from forgetting them, but from learning to live again, to love again. One crisp autumn evening, as the sun set in a blaze of orange and purple, they sat on the porch together, watching the colors fade from the sky. The physical wounds had healed, leaving behind scars that told the story of their survival. The deeper wounds in their souls had scarred over too, no longer raw and aching, but reminders of the journey that had brought them here. He reached over and took her hand. His was large, calloused, and scarred. Hers was smaller, but strong and capable. Their fingers intertwined, a perfect, natural fit. "This place," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "It was always just a house. You made it a home." Alara leaned her head against his shoulder, her heart full. "We made it a home," she corrected softly. She was no longer the damsel who had been rescued. She was the woman who had helped the rescuer save himself. Her journey from a caged bird to a free woman was complete. She had not just found safety. She had found belonging. She had found a love that was not possessive or demanding, but quiet, steady, and as true as the northern star. Their happily ever after was not one of grand adventures or dramatic declarations. It was written in the quiet moments, in shared sunrises, in the planting of a spring garden, in the warmth of a hand held in the twilight. It was the profound, inspirational beauty of two broken souls finding wholeness in each other, building a future not on the ashes of their pasts, but on the solid ground of a love forged in courage and honor. So where does the story truly end? Does it end when the villain is defeated and the dust settles? Or is that just the beginning? We've walked with Alara from the terror of her flight to the strength she found in her own hands. We've watched Josiah, a man entombed by grief, find his way back into the light, not by forgetting his past, but by building a new future. Their story teaches us a powerful truth. Sometimes, the greatest storms of our lives are not there to break us, but to wash us clean and deliver us to the shores of our true destiny. It reminds us that courage isn't always a roar. Sometimes, it's the quiet voice at the end of the day saying, "I will try again tomorrow." And love, true love, is not about possession. It's about protection, respect, and giving someone the space to become the person they were always meant to be. The world is full of lonely cabins and people hiding from their own pain. But it is also full of unexpected storms, of fateful encounters that have the power to change everything. Every one of us has a past, a set of wounds we carry. But the story of Josiah and Alara shows us that these wounds do not have to define our future. Hope can be found in the most unexpected places, and a new life can be built, piece by piece, with courage, honor, and an open heart. What do you think? Do you believe that even the deepest solitude can be healed by love? Let us know in the comments below. If their journey from desolation to hope inspired you, please consider liking this video and subscribing to our channel for more stories of redemption, courage, and the enduring power of the human spirit. Thank you for joining us on this frontier of the heart.